Olá, boa noite. Ele fez o que alguns filósofos já pensaram um dia em fazer: retomar a obra de Karl Marx e reescrever o Capital, levando em conta o que acontece no mundo atual. O filósofo de quem nós estamos falando é tido como um dos mais originais pensadores marxistas da atualidade. Crítico severo do capitalismo, ele defende a ideia de que é possível construir uma sociedade pós-capitalista livre das maldades do capital e também do capitalismo. No centro do Roda Viva, esta noite, o filósofo húngaro István Meszáros, professor emérito da Universidade de Sussex, na Inglaterra, formado em filosofia em Budapeste em 1954, István trabalhou com o renomado filósofo húngaro George Lukacsi e depois deu aulas em universidades da Itália, da Escócia, do Canadá e da Inglaterra. O professor István Meszáros já escreveu vários livros traduzidos em vários países. Nos últimos anos, concentrou seus estudos e análise nas questões sociais do mundo globalizado e nos mecanismos de funcionamento do capitalismo. Esse trabalho resultou num livro de 1.200 páginas que ele acaba de lançar no Brasil, cujo título é Para Além do Capital. O prefácio lembra que vivemos em uma época de crise histórica sem precedentes e que a saturação do sistema de capital criou sérios dilemas. O livro é uma dura crítica ao capital e ao capitalismo e procura afirmar a ideia de que o mundo pode abandonar o modelo de globalização neoliberal e encontrar um caminho alternativo através de um socialismo renovado. E para entrevistar o filósofo húngaro István Meszáros, nós convidamos o sociólogo Emir Sáder, professor, doutor e coordenador do Laboratório de Políticas Públicas da Universidade do Estado do Rio de Janeiro. O professor Ricardo Antunes, professor titular de Sociologia do Instituto de Filosofia e Ciências Humanas da Unicamp. Conosco também o ensaísta Carlos Nelson Coutinho, que é graduado em Filosofia e é titular em Teoria Política da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. O economista Luiz Gonzaga Beluso, professor da Unicamp e editor da revista Carta Capital. A professora de Sociologia Maria Orlanda Pinassi, da Unesp, a Universidade Estadual Paulista. E o jornalista Haroldo Cerávalo Cereza, jornalista do jornal O Estado de São Paulo. O programa Roda Viva, como você sabe, é transmitido em rede nacional para todos os estados brasileiros e também para Brasília. O Roda Viva hoje é um programa gravado, por esse motivo, então, você não vai poder fazer perguntas como normalmente você está acostumado. Professor István, boa noite. Professor, eu gostaria de perguntar inicialmente para o senhor o seguinte. Este ano, nós vamos ter eleições no Brasil. Vamos escolher um novo presidente da República do Brasil. Pelo menos 3 partidos políticos brasileiros, ou 4, dizem que são partidos socialistas. Então eu gostaria de perguntar ao senhor o seguinte. Primeiro, o que é um partido socialista? E segundo, o que é que o programa desse partido tem que ter para, na sua opinião, ser um partido socialista?
It's a difficult question because in part it depends of the situation, of the circumstances. Ideally, you could say the socialist parties should follow the perspective of a radical transformation because so much has to be changed. Our society has to be changed from top to bottom. And for that reason, parties which want to be successful in this must have a very far-reaching radical program. At the same time, they operate in a particular historical situation. They have to appeal to their followers, they have to appeal to the voters, and therefore can't have this ideal way of presenting the problems. They have to find some form of transformation from the present in some steps in the direction of the future. In fact, the subtitle of my book is Towards a Theory of Transition. I am acutely aware that we can't jump from this society into another society which would be viable. Therefore, we have to find the connections, the leverages through which the transformation can be feasible. That's why I'm talking also of transition. And a socialist party in Brazil or whatever country, I don't think the particular differences of nationalities are here of paramount importance with regard to this particular question. In some other respects, there may well be. But with regard to this question, if the transformation, the target of social transformation is a very far-reaching, radical one, they all have to orient themselves towards that target and find the points of contact and leverages to the present from which this process can continue.
Professor Mészáros.
Professor Meszáros, uma distinção essencial na sua obra é aquela entre capital e capitalismo, limites diferenciados entre um e outro. Na sua visão, os chamados estados socialistas que desapareceram recentemente teriam rompido com o capitalismo, mas não com o capital. Queria saber o que seria necessário para romper com o que o senhor chama de metabolismo do capital. E, particularmente, no caso da União Soviética, de que forma ela induziu, na sua visão, esse metabolismo. Desde o começo, quando Lenin definiu o socialismo como a industrialização mais dos sovietes, ou quando definiu a NEP, ou quando Stalin definiu a industrialização forçada, ou se desde o começo, por ser um país periférico, já estava condenado ao metabolismo do capital.
The big problem in the Soviet Union was the backwardness of its economy, backwardness of the society in general. In fact, when the whole process started, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were hoping that the Russian Revolution will be followed by other revolutions. So this terrible backwardness of the society can be remedied by those societies, by the revolution in those societies, Germany, England, and others, which were far more advanced at the industrial and agricultural level. And I mean, that was, I think, one of the tragedies of the historical situation, that the leaders of this revolution put their faith into something over which they had no control whatsoever. Because if the revolution in those other countries doesn't come about, as in fact it didn't, what can you do? And Lenin's answer was almost a pessimistic answer. He said, well, we can't just hand back the power to the Tsar. So we have to carry on the way we can. It's a holding operation. He used this expression. It's a holding operation until the situation becomes much more favorable. So it can proceed in a certain way. Now, Lenin's position, therefore, wasn't what became later the position of Stalin, that we are going to build socialism in a single country. That was a non-starter. There was never any possibility of building socialism in the world, in this enormous world, on the basis of an extremely backward economy. So Stalin turned this holding operation, according to Lenin, which is defined in strictly temporary terms, into a model. That was, therefore, had terrible with its consequences in other directions, for other parties, for all those parties which tried to follow the Stalinist line. Because if you admit honestly that what you are doing is developing a society from an extremely primitive economic basis towards something higher, that's one thing. If you then decree at the same time that this is the model for all socialist transformation, only big trouble can come out of that. And I think that is when we consider these problems, they must be always re-examined historically. The tendency, unfortunately, of parties in the context in which they operate is to push aside the historical dimension and idealize themselves. And this is not only for the true about the party of Stalin, it is true about many parties in the world. Some of the parties which are in existence today. I come from England, and that the party which is in government today in England calls itself New Labour, and idealize itself in the same way as often parties do. Now, I think if we are serious about returning to the program of a socialist transformation, as I am convinced myself that we must, then this idealization, this ahistorical idealization, is what must be pushed aside. And instead of this ahistorical idealization, decreeing models, because Stalin was not the only one decreeing models. Now the model which is decreed in England is the model of the third world, the third way, the third road, the third road as a model. My goodness, it sounds to me a very bad joke when your alternatives are quite dramatic, and then you decide that the real model is to follow a third. You don't consider either one or the other, but invent a third. And I think, returning to the Soviet Union, the trouble was that from this conception, this idealized conception of a model, the Stalinist model, terrible consequences followed for other countries, especially for Germany, where Stalin's line meant that the Social Democratic Party had to be denounced as social fascists, and the socialists and the Social Democrats, as one of the socialist, potentially socialist forces, were turned against communists and vice versa. And Hitler benefited enormously from it. And I could go on what happened later on in Eastern Europe, where also a great deal of damage was produced by imposing on those societies this Stalinist kind of model for which there was no basis in reality.
Professor István, já que o senhor tocou na questão da União Soviética, a imprensa brasileira sempre diz aos brasileiros em geral, aos seus leitores de uma forma geral, que o socialismo ou o comunismo acabaram com a queda do Muro de Berlim e sempre tomam conta, como exemplo, a União Soviética, como o senhor explicou agora há pouco. É fato mesmo que o comunismo acabou, como insistem alguns setores, até da intelectualidade brasileira e mundial?
Well, it depends what you mean by communism. Because in the first place, by Marx, communism was defined as the higher stage of socialism, where again it was emphasized that historically you can't jump to that stage. You can't. You have to resolve some enormous fundamental problems of society. Again, this question of transition, how do you get from one type of society, one type of social metabolic reproduction to the other. So they have to be resolved. They have their own conditions, both objective conditions and subjective conditions, because it's not enough to produce material goods. You also have to transform the people. And in that sense, Marx was talking about that under communist type of higher level of society, and the people to go with it who have been educated in this spirit, they are supposed to produce according to their abilities and receive from the social pool according to their need. Now, if you consider both sides of this equation, you can only produce according to your abilities if you have a substantial agreement with the purposes, with the aims of that society. If you are in disagreement, especially if you are in violent disagreement, then you refuse to produce according to their abilities. What do you do instead? You do the absolute minimum, and maybe not even that, because you can also interfere with the production and push it back. And what about the rewarding people according to their need? Well, that's again, who is going to decide what are the needs of the people? In the Stalinist kind of system, it was that bureaucratic operation which decided for you and me and everybody else what are your legitimate needs. So if you think of that type of society as communism, well, that is obviously dead. You're right, that is dead. But for me, that was not a communist society in any sense of the word. For you might even say it was stillborn. It was born dead, if you like, already, because of those historical and other constraints. And to refer it to the collapse of the Soviet system, which is also a historical reality, it's a fact. Obviously, some people draw from it the conclusion that, all right, there is no more problem. Socialism, communism is dead, and capitalism triumphs, and forever and ever we live under this system. Well, unfortunately, with this kind of looking at the problems, is that we are not going to live very long if we follow the imperatives of the system which controls our society, our social metabolism. And that's why I would say, no, socialism is not at all dead. It is there as a challenge for the future. But we must learn from the terrible contradictions of the past, because without that we could only repeat it. The reason why I spent 25 years of my life writing this book is primarily with regard to the future, because I'm convinced that the problems will arise again for the future. And if we don't learn from the past, that future is very dark, because the dangers of humanity's self-destruction through capital, through the power of the capital, the logic of capital, the objective imperatives of capital, is such, the irrationality which characterizes the system is such that if we are not careful, if we don't devise an alternative way of controlling all aspects of our life, within very easily foreseeable period of time, we'll be all dead.
Professor Veloso, sua pergunta, professor.
Professor Mészáros, uma das características do Marx no Capital, meu juízo, é procurar partir da sociedade tal como ela existe, tal como ela está constituída pelo seu desenvolvimento histórico. Nesse sentido, Marx era um revolucionário que queria conservar as conquistas burguesas, num certo sentido, né? Ele sempre repete, insiste, tanto nos manuscritos como no Capital, a ideia de que, no fundo, ele procura mostrar que o capitalismo é incapaz de cumprir as consignas da Revolução Francesa, liberdade, igualdade e fraternidade, que, na verdade, ao contrário do que aparece, né, do que nos aparece, na aparência, no sentido do Marx, o capitalismo é um regime despótico. Não só despótico, como contraditório. Eu gostaria que o senhor me dissesse como é que, no seu livro, o senhor desenvolve essa ideia de que é preciso conservar para fazer a revolução. Quer dizer, é preciso conservar os ideais da conquista burguesa, da liberdade, da igualdade, da fraternidade.
Yes. Well, my answer is that we must maintain what can be maintained. But again, I would point in the direction of the necessary historical qualifications, because the capitalism under, well, in the period when Marx lived, when so many things were completely different, is incomparable with the capitalism of today. Marx very often emphasized this great power of productivity of capital, and he was convinced that we can use that in the future, and we can build on that. That it is a process from which we can adopt many things and use it as the basis for the future. Unfortunately, since that time, capitalism and capital as such has gone through tremendous crises, historical crises. And I can remember, remind all of us that this crisis involved two terrible world wars, devastations. That capitalism is not what Marx knew. Marx never had anything like that in front of him. The question, the possibility of a world war never entered his horizon. Now, had it been, he would have had to consider what is the reason for that. What has changed in the metabolism of capital itself, in the logic, in the imperatives of capital to produce these devastations. Because ultimately, there were wars also in Marx's lifetime, but they were minor ones. You might call them skirmishes. But the idea of a world war, of the world being brought to self-destruction, never could be considered by Marx. So what I would say, the historical changes which have taken place make it very, very different for us, and also with regard to what we can adopt and what we can maintain from it. To give you just a couple of examples, the elements of destruction in capital production, capitalist production, but also capital production, the expansion of capital, are so great today that it is immensely wasteful. The system is immensely wasteful. Wastefulness is a clear characteristic of our life. Why? Because of the way in which the system functions today. Militarist production in Marx's lifetime was non-existent. So I think that is one of the major qualifications which have to be made.
É claro, mas o senhor cita vários trechos dos Grundrisse em que o Marx aponta nessa direção, no caráter não só contraditório, como autodestrutivo do capitalismo, destrutivo, na verdade, do seu ambiente, da vida das pessoas, etc. Quer dizer, isso está posto, não é, como uma possibilidade, inclusive a destruição das suas próprias bases de reprodução, que é o trabalho vivo.
Yes, you're right. I mean, he was aware of it, that these tendencies of destructive tendencies are present. But these are no longer simply tendencies for the future, but brutal, massive realities for the present. And that makes it very difficult to maintain the kind of positive attitude which he had. And you know, I quoted more than once the words of great liberal political economist Schumpeter, who was putting the problem of production and destruction in such a way that, yes, under capital there is destruction, but it is productive, it is very positive. Our reality is that so much of what has to be produced, so much of production is today destructive in the direct sense of the word, because to consider what the resources the wealth we waste, for instance, in militarist production. They are astronomical. In Marxist lifetime, they were little trifle compared to what we are doing. So this is something that has to be radically altered with regard to our perspective of the future. And it won't be easy, because militarist production is also militarist political power.
Haroldo.
Professor Meszáros, o senhor falando de militarização, o fim da Guerra Fria não pôs nenhum tipo de freio na corrida armamentista. Na verdade, o que a gente vê hoje é, inclusive, essa corrida atingindo países que estavam fora do eixo do confronto entre o sistema soviético e o grupo capitalista. Por que o senhor acha que não houve nenhum tipo, mesmo de diminuição do investimento em armamentos, e como o senhor vê, que importância o senhor acha qual a importância das Forças Armadas na política, no jogo político atual?
Well, I think primarily the question is not militarism when we consider militarist production. It's not militarism as such. Only in some areas of the world we saw this translation of the militarist need, militarist production, also in political military dictatorships. Unfortunately, Brazil was one of them. The dictatorship not so many years ago was an expression of that. And Latin America has seen many of them. Many of them in the past, which were quite ferocious. But when you consider the major forces in this respect, yes, the United States and England and France and so on, there the question is primarily economic and not military political. Economic in the sense that the economy, capitalist economy, needs this kind of militarist production, and this takes us to an important concept we have to be aware of: the rate of utilization of the goods we are producing. And one of the characteristics of 20th century capitalist development was precisely a decreasing rate of utilization. Now, here comes the ideal product. You know, when it comes to nuclear bombs, you can invest vast amounts of human wealth into it without using any of them anytime. So you can have the ideal for capital, in a sense, would be to get out of its contradictions and difficulties by reducing the rate of utilization to zero. Because if it could achieve that, then there would be no limit to the expansion of production. Mm. And that is a very naive notion, because the resources are not infinite. Mm-hmm. Resources are finite. And capital expansion linked to unlimited production has a terrible contradiction, which then brings with it also the military dimension. Now, again, a historical qualification, because in more recent times, we have seen a major change in the way in which the political and military forces have been realigned. And while imperialism at the age of Lenin was characterized by a multiplicity of competing imperialist countries and forces, and this went on also with the Second World War. Today, this is no longer the case. Yeah. Today, imperialism cannot be a multiplicity of competing countries, competing powers. There is only one power which can enforce its militarist interest on the rest of the world, and that is, of course, the United States. All the others, I mean, England has its own nuclear bomb, but who has the finger which controls the delivery of the bomb? It's the Americans. So it's nuclear weaponry which exists by the grace of the Americans. The French have their nuclear weapons, but again, it's laughable compared to the other. So here you have a situation in which one particular military power can also dictate political and military conclusions. I wrote in another book, a little book, that the future of the control of power will be the nuclear blackmail. In the past, we had what was called gunboat diplomacy. You know, the great military powers lined up their gunboats and either used them in order to control some areas or simply threatened to use them. Because often the gunboat diplomacy could produce the result that they didn't have to use them, they could simply threaten its use. Now we have reached again a stage when gunboat diplomacy in this most dangerous form entered our horizon and have no illusions about it, because the United States decreed on the 30th of September that it has the right to enter militarily any country, even those countries where it has no military bases. Okay, this is now current accepted doctrine, accepted in the United States, of course. I am not so sure that the others accept it. So that's one side of the problem. At the same time, they decreed, not so long ago, they announced 7 targets. 7 targets for nuclear prevention, so to speak, nuclear war if the need arises. And these 7 targets already constitute what I call nuclear blackmail. Because those targets which are announced, that unless you behave in a certain way, you can be subject to nuclear war, these are very important targets. And to contemplate nuclear intervention in our world is absolutely horrendous. Remember, just recently, Pakistan and India have been confronting one another, and both of them are nuclear powers, and the possibility of nuclear exchange exists also there. So you have then the prospect, if you really embark on that road and you use those nuclear weapons, that affects the rest of humanity. Nuclear fallout doesn't know national boundaries. And that is the big problem for the future, because capital needs this kind of development, economic development, whereby you can contemplate a zero rate of utilization. It is of no interest to capital how the goods produced are actually used by human beings. The domination of use value by exchange value is such that it's enough for capital to produce use values and exchange values and carry on for the production of other exchange values. There is no need for using them in principle. And once you have sold certain goods, the process of capital realization has taken place. And this is an absurd system, because you can continue to waste terrible amounts of human resources which are needed in this world, so badly needed everywhere, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, everywhere, and even, I would add now, even in the capitalistically most developed countries where poverty is increasing. Child poverty is increasing and even has to be admitted in official statistics. So these are the problems we face, and waste on a colossal scale is, unfortunately, our reality.
Gostaria de passar a próxima pergunta para o professor Ricardo Antunes. Professor.
Eu queria aproveitar, professor István Mészáros, esta temática e lhe fazer uma pergunta. Quer dizer, o século XXI começou de modo muito turbulento, né? E ele talvez possa ser datado, seu início, né, em 89, com o fim da União Soviética, em 99, com Seattle, com o início da Batalha de Seattle, depois Nice, Praga, Gênova, Fórum Social Mundial, né? Digamos assim, as manifestações contra o sistema global dominante, e também com 11 de setembro. Né? Eu perguntaria, qual desses três momentos, de algum modo ou outro, sinaliza o início do século XXI? E gostaria também de perguntar o papel do Estado, né? 11 de setembro, o significado disso, o senhor tratou um pouco já nas primeiras questões. Isso sinaliza um fortalecimento, um definhamento, uma alteração do papel do Estado, tanto nas economias centrais quanto nos países do Sul. Então, a primeira questão, o que sinaliza o século novo, estas datas ou algo, né? E um pouco o papel do Estado.
Well, the role of the state is immense in our society. You have to contrast that with the fantasy, the neoliberal fantasy, rolling back the boundaries of the state. Instead, the boundaries of the state become rolling in the opposite direction. The role of the state, the power of the state is all-inclusive. And this is a very important historical question, because at the beginning of capitalistic developments, way back in the age of Henry VIII in England, Marx himself emphasized that Henry VIII gave a tremendous help for the development of capitalism, what he considered, what he called, his expression, extraneous help, not properly to the nature of capital, which can operate with its economic mechanisms up to a point. But the political intervention, the political power of the state of Henry VIII, I mean, it is obvious, it's undeniable. And it was very important for the development, for the early development of capitalism. Then came the classic phase, when the political sector has been pushed into the background. And Adam Smith was himself talking in those terms and with the greatest condemnation of politicians. He considered just a nuisance, an interference which we have to get rid of and use the market, which is basically what the way he characterized the invisible hand, the beautiful expression. The invisible hand will put right things. You don't have to have the visible hand of the politicians. Now, this is what has been reversed in the 20th century, because the power of the state is so vital and has been so vital from the beginning of the 20th century and ever increasing. So this extraneous help, which once upon a time was only the original push, and then capital followed its own logic and its own power of imposing itself, this is no longer sufficient. So this is a very regressive development in the history of capitalism and in the history of capital. So for the future, this is a great warning, because the state is now involved in every conceivable way by providing political and military guarantees on one hand, and on the other hand, by providing astronomical funds to put at the disposal of capitalistic enterprises. And I always say that the capitalist system would not survive for a week, but perhaps not even for one day, without this very active involvement of the state.
Professor István, já que o senhor falou da participação do Estado, o senhor falava, eu pensava aqui um pouco em Cuba. Em Cuba.
Em Cuba?
Yeah. Minha pergunta, o que existe em Cuba é de fato socialismo? E o que é que vai acontecer depois que o Fidel Castro morrer?
The second question is very difficult to foresee. The first question is very easy to answer. There couldn't possibly be socialism in Cuba. It is a country encircled by very hostile forces, and it simply has to survive. And it survived for 43 years. That is its achievement. So it's, in a way, negative achievement under this threat. Whether this can continue under the successors of Fidel Castro, that's a very big question mark. It has so many negative things are piling up against it. And I must also say, not only in terms of its own internal difficulties of production, because socialism in one country, like Cuba, I mean a tiny island, how could it be socialism in one country when it was inconceivable in the Soviet Union, or inconceivable in a country the size of China with 1,350 million people? How could it be for 10 million people? How could it establish socialism under those circumstances? And then you have to add to it also the greater, more aggressive military power of the United States. One of the states denounced recently by the Bush administration is precisely the Cuban state. They are not happy to keep Cuba, which they consider their backyard, in existence. So obviously there is a great danger that either through internal disintegration of the economy and then the introduction of capitalist forces to greater and greater extent, the whole thing will go in the negative direction, or possibly even another military intervention, another militarist intervention. I certainly wouldn't dare to exclude that concept, because we have reached a stage in historical development when the concept of terrorism is stretched like a strudel. Everything can be covered under the concept of terrorist, and Cuba can be condemned as a terrorist state. It's only a question of when. I remember recently an article published by one of the leading politicians in the United States, who was already trying to use the American power in that sense, saying that Cuba is a supplier of biological warfare for Saddam Hussein and whoever else. Now, what was his evidence for it? Is that medical production in the in Cuba is extremely high, which is undeniable. There is a very high industrial production of very sophisticated medicine. From that, he jumps to the conclusion, here is the proof that Cuba is manufacturing biological weapons. These people have no morality. They have no scruples. They are confronting problems, and they think that with their simple-minded and aggressive way, they can simply wipe out of the problem itself and the country to go with it out of existence.
Professora Maria Leolanda.
Professor Meszáros, nesse seu livro, Para Além do Capital, o senhor retrabalha a questão do totalitarismo, né? O senhor coloca o totalitarismo não como um fenômeno que surge em determinados momentos, né, da história do capital, como um momento necessário para colocar ordem na casa, né, mas como uma essência permanentemente colocada pelo capital, uma necessidade do próprio capital, né, de se reproduzir dessa forma, totalitária, né. Dessa forma, eu gostaria de perguntar para o senhor se a relação entre capital e democracia é uma contradição ou é uma falácia?
Pretty big contradiction, because capital is a comprehensive, all-comprehensive mode of controlling our life. Our reproduction has to be controlled by capital in every dimension, in economy, in politics, in culture, even in religion. You know, the religious are not isolated from the demands of the capital system, and in that sense, it is totalitarian. Now, when it comes to democracy, well, that comes out very, very clearly, that democracy can be permitted for a few countries in under certain circumstances. But democracy is an exception for capital. The overwhelming majority of countries in the world didn't have democracy. They had illusions of democracy or propaganda of democracy, but no real democratic institutions. Some were on the border between, all right, having democratic governments for a while, but then when a crisis arises in their society, the authoritarian reversal of the processes sets in. Remember Allende in Chile? Remember your own country? Remember Guatemala? You have so many instances of it, and the same is true Suharto. What a great Democrat he was. And he was sustained for 32 years, this vicious dictator, as a representative of the free world and democracy. Well, this is insult to the intellect, insult to a reason to have this kind of distortion. So the democracy is very problematical. And I would like to stress another dimension, that in recent years, because of this structural crisis of capital, I write about not the conjunctural crisis of capitalism, but the structural crisis of capital. Authoritarian legislation has become an integral part of all of the states, even in the capitalistically most advanced countries, and even those countries which were proud to call themselves liberal democracies. And again, remember what has happened under Margaret Thatcher in England, a whole range of authoritarian measures against labor, which were all retained by the new Labour government, and some of them even made worse. So democracy is problematical. It is endangered, and it depends on the circumstances of capital development, capital expansion, whether this luxury of democracy can be permitted or not. And some of the most advanced capitalist countries, like Germany, had a phase of totally fascist developments. The same is true of Italy. There were all kinds of problems in all over the world. And let us not idealize the United States as a democratic country, because it works as a democratic country because you have two parties which are identical. You elect one, and then after some time you elect another. There is a good expression for it in English, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Between Tweedledee and Tweedledum you have a continuity and some kind of stability. But when you compare this with the development, with the history of the American labor movement, there was a period of very radical developments in the American labor movement, and they had to be smashed with the most ruthless authoritarian methods. So I would always stress that we have to consider these problems in their historical context. And with regard to the future, democracy is endangered, and that's why for us it is a duty. It is extremely important for us to retain the values of democracy in a substantive sense and defend it against those authoritarian tendencies, authoritarian forces, which are inseparable from capital.
Professor Coutinho.
Em toda a sua obra, István, mas você já se referiu a isso aqui hoje, você considera que a Revolução Socialista ou é mundial, ou é universal, ou não é, né? E chega a afirmar, uma afirmação que me parece muito correta, que os Estados Unidos é envolvido nesse processo, né, ou então o socialismo não será nunca universal. No prefácio à edição brasileira do Para Além do Capital, você revela, eu diria, algum otimismo sobre as potencialidades revolucionárias na América Latina. Como você sabe, você conhece muito bem o Brasil e sabe que há uma probabilidade concreta, uma possibilidade concreta de que o Lula e o Partido dos Trabalhadores ganhem a eleição presidencial. Se no governo Lula e o PT propuserem realmente a realização do programa do partido, que ainda é um programa socialista, né, o que é possível fazer, né, a partir, digamos, de um país periférico, no sentido de transformações efetivamente socialistas. E eu generalizaria não só para o Brasil. Eu diria um partido socialista que chegue ao poder em algum país, não só da periferia, mas do próprio centro do capitalismo, que medidas pode tomar que sejam efetivamente medidas não de reformar apenas o capitalismo, mas de construir alternativas ao capitalismo e ao capital?
Well, in isolation, surely not. Also here, the question will be answered by what sort of responses are forthcoming from different directions. For me, the potentiality of Latin America is immense, because the problems are great, the problems are grave, the problems cannot be swept out of existence, and therefore it is only a question of time when such steps have to be taken as to remedy the situation. But here again we have to remind ourselves that this doesn't come about simply by a party being elected to government, because the reality is that although parties are elected to government, capital remains in power. Parties come and go and change, governments come and go and change, but capital is remaining all the time in control of our social metabolism. So that is the challenge. That's why I say it is the target of transformation can only be beyond capital, against capital, eradicating capital and putting something positively in its place. Now, obviously it cannot be resolved in one go. There will be many initiatives, many beginnings, but these beginnings will not be isolated. The big difference from what happened in Russia in 1917 was this isolation, complete isolation of Russia and encirclement of a country the size of Russia. Now, that was under much more favorable circumstances as far as capital was concerned. Today we live in the age of the structural crisis of the capital system as such. Therefore, the relation of forces can change, and one step can lead to somewhere else, to another. I say that the future of socialism can only be positively decided if also the most advanced, the capitalistically most advanced countries open themselves to this transformation. And the United States is an obvious example. But it won't start there. It will start in areas like Latin America, where the problems are extremely grave and the challenges are so grave, and hopefully the political forces are also stronger to take up these challenges.
Um esclarecimento ainda na pergunta do professor Coutinho, doutor Meszáros. Caso Lula venha a ser eleito presidente do Brasil, ele pode sofrer, por exemplo, o que o Allende sofreu e acabou sendo derrubado no poder? Quer dizer, esse isolamento que o senhor citou agora há pouco, isso pode ocorrer ao Brasil caso o Lula venha a ser eleito presidente, haja vista, como disse o professor, a um programa socialista?
Well, I fear that if he is elected, it won't be received with great applauses in Washington. So the problem of how to undo what has been done will be real for your country as much as for the others. For that reason, these problems can only be solved once there is an impetus. And Lula also obviously has to face the other side of the problem. But without a social movement, a social mass movement, his own position and the position of the Brazilian socialist forces is not secure. Only if you have very active, very strong social forces, social movement, backing up, not only backing up, but also pushing these parties in the direction. Parliament is not a democratic institution. Parliament is an endangered institution. Parliament is controlled by capital. Capital controls a lot else, but of course it also controls Parliament. And therefore, capital, which is an extra parliamentary force par excellence. You can't find a better way of expressing what is an extra parliamentary force than capital. It can only be matched by another extra parliamentary force, which can, of course, be also represented in parliament, like Lula or any socialist party. But they won't be able to do it on their own. They can only have success if they are backed up and pushed in a more radical direction from the mass base of Brazilian society or any other Latin American society.
Professor Mészáros, o seu mestre e grande autor para muitos dos que estamos presentes, George Lukacsi, havia caracterizado a ideia de um período de atualidade da Revolução, a partir do seu livro sobre Lenin, a partir da Revolução de 17.
Yes.
Por outro lado, no seu livro, Para além do Capital, o senhor fala da generalização, da indução do metabolismo do capital. Até mesmo áreas de resistência, como o estado de bem-estar social, o estado keynesiano ou a própria China, são induzidas por uma lógica de mercado que generaliza as relações de mercado, relações de metabolismo do capital. Isso significa que estamos cada vez mais longe do socialismo? O fim da União Soviética significa que a atualidade da Revolução desapareceu, ela não é mais atual hoje em dia, ela tem que ser reconstruída, recolocada. O horizonte hoje é um horizonte de outra ordem?
Well, certainly, China is a very big problem. A very big problem in the sense that the Chinese leadership was trying to introduce capitalistic ways of developing its own country. I recall a proverb quoted by the late Deng Xiaoping, who said, "Doesn't matter what is the color of the cat, so long as it catches the mouse." So, meaning that whether it's capitalist or non-capitalist or socialist, the cat should catch the mouse and it's all right. Well, I am not so optimistic about it because it has its own inherent dangers in the form of the blind alleys which it presents. Because in China, the horrendous problem is mass unemployment. Unemployment of cosmic proportions. You know, you have to think of China in order to qualify for the Economist, the London Economist, as a journal, to get its approval, as producing unemployment of 3, 4, 5, 600 million people. It's mind-boggling. It is completely absurd. Now, the penetration of capitalism so far into China has been strictly confined to coastal enclaves. Here and there and everywhere on the coast, you have these enclaves. But when you try to sum up the totality of the population living on those enclaves and reproducing its existence in capitalistic terms, it's no more than 200 million, probably less, much less than that. And you are talking about a country of 1,350 million, which remains in a way of reproducing its existence for which there is a very adequate English expression, living from hand to mouth. It's this kind of direct relationship. And here I come to an extremely serious problem for capital and capitalism. capital has historical failed. It has a great historical failure whose importance cannot be underlined enough, that it could not extend its system in the world as a whole. Half of the world's population doesn't reproduce its conditions of existence in capitalistic terms. It's not economically regulated. The extraction of surplus labor is not economically regulated. And this is very true also of China. And it is true even in the Chinese capitalistic enclaves, because the miserable wages which people receive in those enclaves in order to let you have Chinese goods produced at pitiful prices, at pitiful sell here at pitiful prices, everything you care to mention. In order to have that, you have to have a regulation of the labor force. And the great element of the regulation of this labor force is not capitalistic economic, but political, the governmental political. Now, I think that this tremendous failure of the capital system, what I want to add to it, it is historically the case that Southeast Asia, China, India, Southeast Asia, Africa, many millions of people also in Latin America are in this category, that they do not reproduce their conditions of existence under the metabolism of economic control, which would be the most favorable for capital. That has been already emphasized by Marx. The capitalistic way of developing the economy is the most favorable for productivity. Failure, a complete failure. We cannot underrate the importance of that. But I would add to it, this is not only a historical fact, it is historically inconceivable that this process can be reversed, that we could have a society, a type of development which was followed after the Second World War, the fantasy of modernization, solving all the problems of all of the countries to so-called modernizations. Institutions of development studies were established all over the world which pursued this fantasy agenda. What was the result? They all came to nothing. The whole thing has collapsed. There is no more modernization, and today there is not even the propaganda talk about modernization. So I am not very pessimistic about the notion of capitalism triumphing in China, because it is tiny as it exists today, and in order to make it big, all-inclusive in China, you would have to you have to consent to the kind of horrendous unemployment developing in the country, which would sweep away the government also. And I don't think that the government will be stupid enough to pursue that road.
Professor Meszáros, rápido esclarecimento. O senhor usou a expressão socialismo Mickey Mouse. O que é socialismo Mickey Mouse?
Social Democrats. In England, I wrote that, I gave an interview to radical philosophy, and when the question came up, and you were talking about not only the English social democratic parties, but also the social democratic parties in other parts of Europe. Mickey Mouse socialism, because they have abandoned anything whatsoever do with socialism. Once upon a time they were saying, yes, we do it by very little, very small steps, but we'll eventually reach socialism, which is complete fantasy. Now they don't even talk about little steps. They have abandoned also the idea of reform. There is no question of structural reform in any of the European social democratic parties. And that is, I can only call it Mickey Mouse socialism, because they call themselves, they still, even the English New Labour Party also refers to itself as Socialist Party. What is socialism? my foot is much more socialist than the English Labour Party, because there must be some criteria by which you have to judge it. So it's all right for Mickey Mouse to behave like that, to have, and I also related that question, you know, when I gave that interview was the time when they opened in France the Disneyland, the equivalent of the Disneyland in France, and Mickey Mouse was triumphing, and the social democratic parties were applauding this kind of development as a solution to the problems of humanity. I find it an insult to humanity to think in these terms. It's all right for the screen, for cartoon characters, that's all right.
Professor Veloso.
Professor Meszáros, lendo o seu livro e ouvindo as suas respostas, a questão que mais me preocupa é das relações atuais entre o capitalismo e a democracia. O senhor faz uma apreciação um pouco, a meu juízo, injusta com o pós-guerra, porque no pós-guerra, do meu ponto de vista, a luta política, a luta dos subordinados, dos submetidos, conseguiu avanços importantes do ponto de vista da democracia social, econômica e mesmo política. E, no entanto, isso submergiu na crise dos anos 70. Né? E os partidos socialistas foram impotentes para reinventar uma estratégia que pudesse dar seguimento às vitórias que foram conquistadas no pós-guerra. E hoje nós estamos numa situação muito pior. Né? E às vezes, quando o senhor responde, me dá uma certa ansiedade, porque eu imagino que nós somos condenados ao imobilismo. Né? Somos condenados ao imobilismo. Quer dizer, no fundo, o senhor, ao acentuar corretamente o caráter despótico, totalitário do regime metabólico do capital, o senhor nos diz, não, a luta de classes, a luta política, não tem chance de romper essa barreira inexpugnável.
Well, if you look at post-war developments of capitalism, it is true what you say. There was a great expansion both of capitalistic production, expansion of consumption, also the introduction of the welfare state. That's a significant achievement. And I am the last to deny them. In fact, I would like to have them much more. Much more. Okay. Much more than what we achieved then. But what I also want to point out, that this has come to an end. That in all European countries, the welfare state is almost completely dead. And if you read what is happening in Italy with Berlusconi, his principal project is to liquidate the remnants of the welfare state in Italy itself, to take away the rights from the workers, and takes as a model what has happened under Margaret Thatcher and continues to happen under Tony Blair in England. So his model is Tony Blair because of this authoritarian reversal. So what I say is, yes, it is true until about the late 60s.
The late 60s.
It went on and it was quite successful, but then James Callaghan uttered the word that the party is over. By that he didn't mean his party. His party was really over. It is more or less finished in the sense in which you used to have it. No, it's the party. You consider this is rather an insulting expression of carrying on with the welfare state is an unjustifiable party. It's over, finished. Tighten your belt, that's another expression they use, and let us accept authoritarian legislation against labor. That's what I want. I mean, in historical terms, we have to warn against these tendencies. And we have to warn against it precisely in order to reverse the process. because a reactivation of the mass movement, and that has already to some extent happened in Italy, because you remember how it was when Berlusconi announced his plan of liquidating number 18 of the laws which give labor in Italy some protection rights. There was a massive demonstration against it. There was a demonstration coupled also with a general strike. And 16 million people, never before in the history of Italy, never even in the past, could you count in a general strike 16 million Italians in defense of those rights which they want to retain. So I don't say that neither would I say that the party is over, nor that the struggle is over. The fight has to continue. But you have to be aware of it. What are the forces against it? And capital, the margin of capital expansion has become more and more problematical. This is why they have to resort to those measures. And I wrote about these authoritarian tendencies at the very beginning when this process started, in the mid-70s, with regard to Thatcher and others. And they have achieved quite a lot in this respect, but we can also reverse it.
Pois não, professor.
Eu queria que você tratasse um pouco de uma questão que está presente em seu livro e que parece crucial no mundo contemporâneo, né? Você trata da questão do trabalho, mostrando como a precarização não é alternativa e é preciso pensar numa sociedade do tempo disponível, né? E esta seria, digamos, uma nova forma, né, de se pensar uma estrutura da sociedade. E trata também nele, eu gostaria que você comentasse, ainda que de modo breve, como a luta feminina e a questão da mulher tem sido tratada no universo do capitalismo como uma igualdade formal e que é preciso pensar numa igualdade substancial. Essas duas questões, a do trabalho, a questão feminina e a questão ecológica, são cruciais para um pensamento transformador hoje, porque são questões que, né, aparecem com muita intensidade. Eu queria que você tratasse um pouco da atualidade e do significado que essas questões têm para o socialismo no século XXI.
Yes, I understand. The problem of precarization and unemployment is perhaps the gravest in terms of its immediate dangers, because it threatens social explosion, social disintegration, because the number of people who are unemployed in the world and sink into poverty is increasing all the time, even in countries which once upon a time in Latin America were considered models for the rest of you, like Argentina. And now it is also officially admitted that 51% of Argentina's population lives in poverty. It's an official figure. I read it in the newspapers. And about 28% is unemployed. Now, no society can afford to live with this way. Now, the precarization is different in different countries. For instance, in England, one way of running away from the magnitude of unemployed is to fiddle with the figures. You falsify the figures, and precarization takes a positive expression in the sense that part-time labor is something very positive. It's good for the women in particular, who are very happy to take home only a miserable sum of money because they want to be free from work. Now this is, again, a cynical absurdity. Precarization in that form is really condemning people to very precarious conditions. And I want to mention that in England, if you work 16 hours a day, you are considered in full employment, okay? And in Japan, if you work 2 hours in the last week of the month in Japan, you are not counted as unemployed. Now that's even cleverer than the English one. And you are not going to solve the problem in this way by falsifying the figures, by creating unemployment on a massive scale, as a result of which we find that in every country the standard of living of the working people is falling, and that includes the United States of America. The general standard of living in the United States has fallen by a considerable sum in the last 10, 15 years. Now, with regard to women, I consider an extremely important question for the future, because that really affects one of the absolute conditions of capital as a mode of social metabolic reproduction. Because it is in the heart of the question of equality. Equality not simply in the sense in which we used to think of equality, or which they want us to think about equality, of having the right to vote. Even that is a very recent development. Women could not vote in Switzerland until very recently. In England, the 20s, as late as that, when women could vote, but it didn't change their conditions of existence in a significant way. You vote, and you are being damned. Everything remains in your conditions of life. And even today, in England, although there is supposed to be equality of labor, 70% the women only receive for the same type of work only 70% of what men receive. And here, unfortunately, the problem is so acute, there can be no solution to it, because the conditions are such that capital is incapable, is structurally incompatible with equitable way of running society. Capital is necessarily a system of subordination. Labor must be subordinated structurally to capital. That's axiomatic. Now, if you operate from that axiom, there can be no development in the field of equality. So the Mickey Mouse socialists, who once upon a time used to think about equality with the slogan, equality of opportunity, as opposed to equality of outcome, equality of result. Now they have abandoned even the idea of equality of opportunity. No equality whatsoever. Equality is a hostile concept. And this is very much in keeping with the nature of capital and the type of control which it must maintain in order to run society.
Alguns colegas do senhor têm usado, e aqui nós temos reproduzido muito, a expressão socialismo de mercado.
Yeah.
É possível existir socialismo de mercado?
Yeah. Well, I would like to see it, socialism and liberty, but when you think about such concepts as equality, liberty, fraternity, they originated a long time before socialism. They originated during the French Revolution. And what happened to them? They have been all wiped out. There is no the liberty itself is confined to the ability to vote, to put a piece of paper once in 4 or 5 years into the electoral urn. And that is supposed to be your freedom. Freedom is a very important positive concept. Freedom is the ability to realize our gifts, our aspirations. That is what could be considered freedom. Not that little piece of paper, which then, once they are elected, most parties I know in Europe, the day after the election, they start to break all their promises. You know, it used to be said about the Labour Party that the Labour Party writes a manifesto, and all it promises breaks after being elected to government. Now the situation is changed a little bit in the sense now they break all their promises even before writing the manifesto. And therefore the whole process becomes extremely problematical. That people are invited to elect a government, and the last time the British government was elected was the lowest possible percentage in all history, all British political history. And therefore it shows that people are turning against this way of running the problem. So the democracy problematical, liberty is problematical, equality, forget it. It's not even mentioned.
Haroldo, infelizmente nosso tempo está se extinguindo. Nós estamos praticamente no final do programa. Eu queria rapidamente só pedir ao professor Meszáros. Professor, nosso tempo está se acabando, nós temos muitas perguntas a fazer ao senhor, mas infelizmente nosso tempo não é suficiente para a grandeza do assunto e para a grandeza da sua participação. Apenas para encerrar, eu gostaria que o senhor rapidamente nos respondesse o seguinte. Um país de terceiro mundo, que depende da importação de capitais para a sua sobrevivência, pode sair do chamado subdesenvolvimento? Sim ou não?
Sadly, lamentably, they don't, because they don't import capital. They don't get capital. Third world countries I always find also as a problematical concept. I never use the expression third world without putting it into inverted commas, because there is no such thing as the third world. It is a subordinate part, an exploited subordinate part of the one and only world, where some countries are powerful and dominate the others, and the third world is, well, suffering the consequences, so-called third world. Now, importing capital is not in the benefit of the third world. The capital, the way in which capital is exported from the powerful countries towards the third world is very iniquitous. It is always, control is retained over it. And the benefits to the third world countries are absolutely minimal. And that's why we have the kind of development which is a truncated, very slow development which we witnessed in the post-war period.
Professor Meszáros, muito obrigado. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Muito obrigado. Bem, o Roda Viva vai ficando por aqui. Gostaria de agradecer também a gentileza dos nossos convidados que participaram conosco hoje no Roda Viva. Nós voltamos na próxima segunda-feira, às 10h30 da noite, com a sua participação efetiva através da interatividade aqui do Roda Viva. E dizer que este é mais um espaço para debate, ideias e para que a gente possa conhecer um pouco melhor o mundo, que é uma das características do jornalismo público que se faz aqui na TV Cultura. Muito obrigado pela sua atenção. Boa noite. Até segunda-feira, às 10h30.